It's the third astral era, and two mages are staring each other down across an aether-scorched battlefield. One of the casters shouts in fury and annoyance toward the other as he lifts his hands skyward. His arcane grimoire began to float from his fingers and shine with an unholy brilliance as a spark of magic erupted before him, manifesting in an all-too-familiar shape. He had brought forth his most powerful evocation and planned on ending this battle soon. His opponent, gasping to catch her breath, rose to her feet in defiance as she clutched her book tight. She answered in kind, proclaiming that she wouldn't allow him to drag their mentor's name through the dirt any longer. As she grabs hold of the remaining aether around her to bring forth her most trusted creation, she readies herself. The two casters command their creations to attack the other, and both roar with power as they collide in the air. With the might of would-be gods, the two entities did battle as their masters wove incantations. The ground shook and the battle ended in a flash of light. He stood over her lifeless body, cursing her for having wounded him so heavily, and making him expend so much power. But it was in this calm after the battle that the silence gave way to a whistle, a noise he had never been afraid of until now. He looked up and was too late noticing an assault-type airship had moved in. In a mix of rage and panic, he looked towards the now defeated body of his former colleague. He may have won the battle, but she had made sure he'd lose the war. As the shell made contact with the ground, the exhausted caster was no more, and both their soul crystals were lost in the aftermath. The captain of the airship hailed his superior, explaining that the traitor had been dealt with, as well as the other mage for good measure. He finished his report, saying he'd continue with the extermination. Glory to the Allegan Empire. The discipline we're covering today is currently the oldest documented job in history. They rose with great fame and reverence during the Allegan Empire's expansion, only for many to be hunted down for their hubris. The knowledge of their craft has been lost for thousands of years, until now. Wielding a mixture of their own aggressive spells and the might of powerful creations, they turn all that oppose them into dust. Today, let us discuss what it means to be a summoner. As stated, summoners are the first jobs in our currently known history to make use of soul crystals. Summoning magic was complicated, and teaching new mages this art was considered too time-consuming for the Empire. The first soul crystals were made to shorten and enrich the teaching process, making sure they always had someone to replace a fallen mage. But why was this art developed in the first place if it was this hard to teach? To answer that, we only need to look to the various people and beast tribes of the world. By now, you're familiar with primals. The ancient Allegans called these creatures icons, but they're one and the same. These godlike beings leech off of the planet's aether and cause elemental imbalance just by existing. Fundamentally, they are nothing more than an idea given form through focused faith and etheric stimulation. A primal does not have any will beyond what the fanatics give it. This is why most all primals are zealous and irrational. The ones creating them typically aren't sound of mind. Like any living creature, it'll seek to continue its existence, thus tempering helpless victims into becoming its thralls. That way, they might provide more faith and aether for it to consume. As the Empire began to conquer the world, more tribes and beastmen made use of primals to try and drive back their oppressors, even if it meant becoming slaves to their creation. The Allegan Empire's answer to the primal threat were summoners. These mages would fight the primals at a distance, using their spells and ethereal constructs. But what made them powerful was that they possessed the unique talent to take the ambient aether that made up a primal's existence and shape it into something they could control. By taking the primal's aether and filtering it through arcane glyphs, they summoned forth creatures that possessed the lightness and powers of primals without the threat of tempering or draining the planet. These evocations would come to be known as Eggies and Demis. Through this art, the power of primals had been inverted. Primals were overwhelmingly powerful, but were stronger than their creators, leaving them to do as they pleased without rhyme or reason. A summoner was the opposite. Their creations were never stronger than them, allowing the mage to command and direct their summons with lethal precision and overwhelming force. As such, the Allagan summoners were praised as heroes, taking the most dangerous weapons of the enemy and turning it against them. For years, the Allagan summoners were showered with honors and praise for their devotion and power, but things began to change as their wars of conquest continued. Many summoners were starting to show signs of defection and betrayal. These once loyal mages began to turn on the Empire. Having taken the power of false gods, they saw themselves as greater than any king or nation. They began using their summons to further their own desires instead of the wishes of the Empire, and these summoners were branded as traitors. The summoners were hunted down and exterminated without hesitation, and even those who didn't defect were not spared. A superstition that summoners were being tempered by their own creations spread like wildfire, inciting the fanatic decision to kill all of them and end the practice entirely. One of the greatest summoners of the Allagan Empire was a man by the name of Master Sari. He had made great advancements in this discipline and had hopes for this school of magic to be taken to even greater heights. But he saw the changes in those summoners he had taught firsthand. His once loyal students turned on him and their homeland, drunk on the power they possessed. This sent Master Sari into a bitter depression that he would never recover from. But there are still traces of his legacy to be found to this day for those who wish to learn from him whilst he was at his best. Many soul crystals belonging to summoners were destroyed, but there were those who collected and hid them so that their studies might be continued in the future. They were so well hidden that the summoning arts were considered lost until the tail end of the 6th Astral Era, when the practice slowly began to rise from the bones of the now dead empire. It officially became a school of magic and study once more and saw more widespread use in the beginnings of the 7th Astral Era. This is the complete history of summoners from their creation, extermination, and reemergence. But what about the powers of a summoner made them so bold as to rebel in the first place? First, let us address the act of creating an Eggy and Demi-summon. In order to create these entities, the caster must have encountered the primal on some level. Most of the time, this involves having been present during its defeat and partaking of the aether that it releases upon death. Like memorizing a code, the summoner need only experience the primal's aether once in order to recreate it. Afterwards, the summoner draws upon the aether around them and summons it into the primal's likeness. Newer summoners must force their Eggies into submission through shows of power and will. But as the mage grows in strength, their summons will begin obeying their masters without hesitation, as the summoner's control over aether becomes more absolute. Furthermore, the existence of an Eggy or Demi isn't harmful to the world because of how easily they're dismissed and how sometimes they're only given enough aether to complete a certain task before disappearing. The entities created by the summoner may not wield the mind-altering or world-shattering powers of the creatures they're based on, but there are two facts that make them better than primals. One is how much easier it is to conjure an Eggy or Demi. No mindless faith or vast amounts of crystals are needed. Second is their flexibility. A skilled summoner is able to conjure whatever is best for any given situation, overwhelming their opponents with the one thing they'll have the hardest time countering. And that's before the summon is enkindled and made to recreate the primal's most lethal attacks. While the Eggies and Demis that are summoned forth by these mages are indeed powerful, it begs the question why they're limited to only the primals they've seen or whose aether they've been able to properly sample. This is the difference of copying something versus making something from scratch. A summoner is mimicking the act of creating a primal on a much smaller scale. This is made easy by knowing exactly what it is they're trying to create and understanding the aether that made them. If a summoner tried to create something they'd never seen or experienced, then the summoned entity's form would have no stable etheric framework to be based on, and its shape would be at the mercy of the caster's shifting imagination. Creating a unique summon isn't impossible, but extremely unlikely given the amount of focus demanded by such a task would be considered beyond most mortal limits. It's far easier to take what's been imagined for you and shape it into something that's eager to fight by your side. But a summoner's power isn't limited by the things they created. They're also able to enter what is called a trance, by stimulating their bodies with the primal's aether. This usually increases the power of their spells and grants them new abilities for a short time. But a short time is all you need when wielding the power of primals. Lastly, let us go over their choice of weapons and attire. Some of you must be confused as to how a book with random scribbles can assist in the creation of spells. But arcane tomes have a storied history. Back in the early ages of man, the use of magic became more commonplace. But after realizing that using their own personal aether was inefficient and dangerous, they tried to supplement the cost of spells by using natural ambient aether around them. This was difficult. Simply trying to force one's will on surrounding aether and direct it was too taxing and arduous. To give aether direction and focus, the creation of crude symbols and circles were used to try and harness it. Like writing down instructions the aether must follow, this method, while barbaric, showed promise. Like discovering the source code of the universe, mages tested and learned which symbols and signs produced the most power. By drawing in surrounding aether, and then charging and filtering it through these geometric symbols, mages began creating extremely potent spells. Eventually, this led to the creation of aetheric entities known as carbuncles, once it was discovered that the right symbols could charge gems with enough aether to give them life. However, writing down these glyphs on hard surfaces was too time-consuming and hardly useful to mages in the heat of battle. Casters began to paint or tattoo these symbols on their bodies to act as reminders and conduits for their spells. Eventually, this was replaced by arcane clothes, made with aether-rich cloth and inscribed with the same symbols and signs needed to weave their spells. But as parchment and books became more and more easy to make, it became clear what method would win. Arcane tomes and scrolls beat out magical tattoos and clothes by a landslide. These books now contain dozens of symbols and incantations needed to stimulate and direct aether into the spells today's summoners desire. These books are even decorated and inscribed with some primals in mind to make the summoning process easier on the caster. A summoner's attire is a different story. Most summoner garb is based on the clothes that have been excavated from the Allegan dig sites. You'll notice that some of the summoner's clothes seem more gaudy and decorative than practical. But like explained earlier, before their extermination, most summoners were seen as magical heroes and were dressed to look as such. While impractical at first glance, the ancient summoner's clothes were found to be woven with aether-rich fabrics, making the wearer more receptive to ambient aether and allowing spells to be cast more liberally. That brings us to the most iconic adornment of a summoner, their horn. While there's no solid text to explain its function, it's believed these horns were meant to act as a bridge between the minds of the caster and their creations. This bridge would allow greater control over their summons and the execution of complex commands with greater accuracy. Their history, powers, and weapons of choice are a force to be reckoned with in the right hands. Summoners may have only recently began to re-emerge, but even after having been gone for thousands of years, their power hasn't diminished in the slightest. If anything, with all the primal aether to be taken these days, now is the time for summoners to once again stand as the heroes they were once adored for. Rise up, summoners. Learn from the mistakes of those who came before you, and show the world what it means to command the power of gods. Good day! Thank you for staying to the end of my lesson. It's my hope that you found something new and interesting in between my ramblings. If you did, consider subscribing and liking this video. Doing that is the easiest way to tell me I'm doing a good job at feeding your thirst for knowledge. If there is a topic you'd love to learn more about that I've yet to cover, let me know in the comments and I'll see where my research takes me. I'd also encourage you to share what you learned here with your friends and adventuring companions, and if they're interested, bring them to the next assembly. I hope to see you and any other curious travelers in the next lecture. Till then, stay safe, my friends.